The Joe Metheny case. Why was he selling hamburgers made with human meat? Chapter 1. In the grimy underbelly of Baltimore, Maryland, where abandoned warehouses and forgotten neighborhoods housed society's most desperate souls, a monster was operating in plain sight. Joe Roy Metheny ran a small roadside stand selling hamburgers and barbecue to unsuspecting customers. But his secret ingredient would make him one of America's most disturbing serial killers. Between 1994 and 1996, Metheny didn't just murder his victims. He butchered them, ground their flesh into hamburger meat, and served them to innocent customers who had no idea they were consuming human remains. His case represents one of the most grotesque examples of cannibalistic serial killing in American criminal history. The Joe Metheny case has been featured in numerous true crime documentaries, including Investigation Discovery's Most Evil and various international crime series. His story challenges our understanding of human depravity and forces us to confront the horrifying reality that monsters can hide in the most mundane places. What makes Metheny's case particularly disturbing is not just the cannibalism, but the calculated way he disposed of his victims while potentially feeding human flesh to hundreds of unsuspecting people. His roadside stand was popular among truckers and local workers who praised his special recipe hamburgers, never knowing the horrific truth about what they were eating. Metheny's crimes were discovered almost by accident, when his boastful confessions to fellow inmates led investigators to uncover a trail of murder and cannibalism that had gone undetected for years. His case exposed how easily a predator could operate in society's margins, preying on vulnerable victims while hiding behind the facade of a small business owner. The investigation revealed that Metheny had targeted prostitutes, homeless individuals, and other marginalized people whose disappearances were unlikely to be thoroughly investigated. His victims were society's forgotten, people whose absence wouldn't be immediately noticed or aggressively pursued by law enforcement. Metheny's psychological profile painted a picture of a man driven by rage, abandonment issues, and a complete lack of empathy for human life. His crimes were motivated not just by violence, but by a twisted desire to degrade and consume his victims in the most literal sense possible. As we delve into this disturbing case, we must confront uncomfortable questions about how society treats its most vulnerable members and how predators exploit these vulnerabilities. We must also examine how someone could commit such heinous acts while operating a business that served the public daily. If you're prepared for this extremely mature and disturbing content about one of America's most depraved killers, make sure to subscribe. The psychological journey we're about to explore reveals the darkest depths of human evil and the horrifying ways it can manifest. Chapter 2. The Making of a Monster. Joe Roy Metheny was born on March 2, 1955, in Essex, Maryland, into a working-class family that would provide the foundation for his later psychological problems. His childhood was marked by instability, violence, and abandonment, factors that would contribute to his development into one of America's most disturbing serial killers. Metheny's father abandoned the family when Joe was very young, leaving his mother to raise him and his siblings alone. This early abandonment created deep-seated issues with trust and attachment that would plague Metheny throughout his life. He never recovered from the feeling that he had been discarded and unwanted. His mother struggled with alcoholism and was often unable to provide the stability and care that her children needed. The household was chaotic and unpredictable, with periods of neglect alternating with episodes of violence and emotional abuse. Metheny learned early that the world was a hostile place where survival required brutality. As a child, Metheny displayed early warning signs of psychological problems, including cruelty to animals, difficulty forming relationships, and explosive anger. He was known for his violent temper and his inability to control his emotions when frustrated or challenged. These behaviors were largely ignored by overwhelmed adults who were dealing with their own problems. Metheny's academic performance was poor, and he left school at an early age to work in various manual labor jobs. His lack of education and limited opportunities contributed to his sense of frustration and resentment towards society. He felt that life had been unfair to him and that he deserved better than what he had been given. In his late teens and early 20s, Metheny worked in various blue-collar jobs, including construction and factory work. He was known as a hard worker, but also as someone with a volatile temper who could explode into violence without warning. His co-workers learned to avoid confronting him or challenging his authority. Metheny's personal relationships were troubled and often violent. He had difficulty maintaining romantic relationships, often becoming possessive, controlling, and abusive when his partners tried to assert independence. His inability to form healthy relationships contributed to his growing isolation and resentment. The death of his mother when he was in his 30s was a devastating blow that seemed to push Metheny over the edge. He had maintained a complicated relationship with her, despite her problems, and her death left him feeling completely alone in the world. This loss would later be cited as a trigger for his descent into murder. Metheny began using drugs and alcohol heavily during this period, further destabilizing his already fragile mental state. His substance abuse exacerbated his violent tendencies and reduced his ability to control his impulses. He became increasingly unpredictable and dangerous to those around him. By the early 1990s, Metheny was living on the margins of society, moving between temporary jobs and unstable living situations. He had developed a deep hatred for what he perceived as society's rejection of him, and he began to fantasize about revenge against those he blamed for his problems. The combination of childhood trauma, abandonment issues, substance abuse, and social isolation had created a perfect storm of psychological dysfunction. Metheny had become a man consumed by rage and resentment, with no empathy for others and no moral constraints on his behavior. Make sure to share this story with others who can handle extremely mature content about criminal psychology and predatory behavior. Metheny's transformation from troubled individual to serial killer was gradual but inexorable. The factors that had shaped his personality, abandonment, violence, substance abuse, and social isolation, had created someone capable of unimaginable cruelty. The stage was set for him to become one of America's most disturbing criminals, the man who would later boast about feeding human flesh to unsuspecting customers was the product of a toxic combination of personal trauma, social dysfunction, and psychological pathology. His story illustrates how untreated mental health issues, combined with adverse social conditions, can create individuals capable of the most horrific crimes. Chapter 3. The Descent into Murder. Joe Metheny's first confirmed murder occurred in 1994, though investigators believe he may have killed earlier victims whose bodies were never found. The transition from troubled individual to serial killer was triggered by a personal crisis that sent him into a murderous rage from which he would never return. The catalyst for Metheny's killing spree was the disappearance of his girlfriend and their 6-year-old son. When he returned home from work one day to find them gone, Metheny flew into a rage that would consume him for years. He blamed drug dealers in the area for either taking them or providing the drugs that led to their departure. Metheny's response to this loss was to hunt down and kill the people he held responsible. He began targeting drug dealers and users in the seedy neighborhoods around Baltimore, using his size and strength to overpower victims before killing them in increasingly brutal ways. His first murders were motivated by revenge, but they quickly evolved into something far more sinister. The initial killings were relatively straightforward. Metheny would lure victims to isolated locations and kill them with whatever weapons were available. However, as his killing spree continued, he began to develop more elaborate and disturbing methods of disposing of his victims' bodies. Metheny's background in manual labor had given him knowledge of tools and techniques that he now applied to dismembering his victims. He was skilled with knives, saws, and other implements that allowed him to efficiently break down human bodies. This practical knowledge would prove crucial to his later cannibalistic activities. The discovery that he could dispose of bodies by dismembering them led Metheny to a horrifying realization: human flesh could be processed and used like any other meat. This revelation marked the beginning of his cannibalistic phase and the most disturbing aspect of his criminal career. Metheny began experimenting with different ways of preparing human flesh. Initially for his own consumption, he claimed that he was curious about the taste and wanted to experience the ultimate form of domination over his victims. This cannibalism represented the complete dehumanization of his victims in his mind. The transition from personal cannibalism to serving human flesh to others was a logical progression in Metheny's twisted thinking. He realized that he could dispose of large quantities of human remains while simultaneously generating income by mixing the flesh with pork and beef to create hamburgers and barbecue. Metheny set up a small roadside stand near Baltimore where he sold food to truckers, construction workers, and other blue-collar customers. His location was strategic, isolated enough to avoid scrutiny, but accessible enough to attract customers. The stand became his perfect cover for disposing of human remains. The process of preparing human flesh for consumption required careful planning and execution. Metheny would grind the human meat with pork and beef, season it heavily to mask any unusual taste, and form it into hamburgers or use it in barbecue. His customers praised his special recipe and often returned for more. The psychological satisfaction that Metheny derived from feeding human flesh to unsuspecting customers was immense. He felt that he was getting revenge on society by forcing people to unknowingly participate in his cannibalistic activities. This gave him a sense of power and control that he had never experienced before. Metheny's killing pattern became more systematic as he refined his methods. He would target vulnerable individuals, prostitutes, homeless people, and drug users who were unlikely to be missed immediately. He would lure them to his trailer or other isolated locations where he could kill and dismember them without detection. Don't forget to hit that like button if you're finding this disturbing psychological analysis as shocking as we are. The efficiency with which Metheny operated his cannibalistic enterprise was remarkable and terrifying. He had created a system that allowed him to murder regularly while disposing of the evidence in a way that actually generated income. His roadside stand became a grotesque monument to human depravity. By 1996, Metheny had killed at least 10 people and had potentially fed human flesh to hundreds of unsuspecting customers. His crimes represented a new level of serial killing that combined murder, cannibalism, and a twisted form of public contamination that defied comprehension. The man who had started killing for revenge had evolved into something far more dangerous, a systematic predator who had found a way to make his murders profitable while satisfying his cannibalistic urges. The worst was yet to come, as his crimes would eventually be discovered in the most shocking way possible. Chapter 4. The Horrific Business. Model Joe Metheny's roadside food stand represented one of the most disturbing criminal enterprises in American history. A business that served human flesh to unsuspecting customers while providing the perfect cover for disposing of murder victims. The stand, located on a busy truck route near Baltimore, became ground zero for an unprecedented form of serial killing. The location of Metheny's stand was carefully chosen to maximize both customer traffic and operational security. Situated along a route frequented by truckers and construction workers, the stand attracted customers who were looking for quick, cheap meals and weren't likely to ask questions about ingredients or preparation methods. Metheny's customer base consisted primarily of blue-collar workers who appreciated what they believed was good, hearty food at reasonable prices. Many became regular customers, praising his hamburgers and barbecue for their unique flavor and generous portions. They had no idea they were consuming human remains mixed with conventional meat. The preparation process for Metheny's special recipe was methodical and horrifying. After killing and dismembering his victims, he would grind the human flesh and mix it with pork and beef in ratios that masked the taste and texture differences. Heavy seasoning and barbecue sauce further disguised the human meat. Metheny took perverse pride in his culinary skills, boasting later that his customers never suspected they were eating human flesh. He viewed this deception as the ultimate form of revenge against a society that he felt had rejected him. Forcing people to unknowingly consume human remains gave him a sense of power and control. The financial aspect of the operation was also important to Metheny. The food stand provided him with legitimate income while solving the problem of body disposal. Instead of having to find ways to hide or destroy evidence, he was actually profiting from his crimes while eliminating the evidence in the most complete way possible. Metheny's victims were carefully selected to minimize the risk of detection. He targeted prostitutes, homeless individuals, and drug users, people whose disappearances were unlikely to trigger intensive police investigations. These vulnerable populations provided him with a steady supply of victims while reducing his chances of being caught. The killing process typically began when Metheny would approach potential victims in areas known for prostitution or drug activity. He would offer them money for sex or drugs, luring them to his trailer or other isolated locations where he could overpower and kill them without being observed. Once the victims were dead, Metheny would begin the dismemberment process using tools and techniques he had learned from his construction work. He was skilled with knives, saws, and cleavers, allowing him to efficiently break down human bodies into manageable pieces for processing. The grinding and mixing of human flesh with conventional meat required careful attention to ratios and preparation. Metheny experimented with different combinations to find the mixture that best disguised the human meat while maintaining the taste and texture that his customers expected. Storage and preservation of the mixed meat was another logistical challenge that Metheny solved through trial and error. He used conventional refrigeration and freezing techniques to maintain the meat's freshness, while ensuring that the human components didn't spoil or develop distinctive odors that might arouse suspicion. The serving process was the culmination of Metheny's horrific enterprise. He would cook the mixed meat into hamburgers or barbecue, serve it to customers with a smile, and collect payment for meals that contained human remains. The normalcy of these transactions masked the unprecedented horror of what was actually taking place. Make sure to subscribe to follow this shocking case to its eventual discovery and resolution. Metheny's psychological satisfaction from his cannibalistic business model was immense. He felt that he was getting the ultimate revenge on society by forcing innocent people to participate unknowingly in his crimes. This gave him a sense of power and control that compensated for his feelings of abandonment and rejection. The scale of Metheny's operation was staggering. Over the course of approximately 2 years, he may have served human flesh to hundreds of customers, making his case unique in the annals of serial killing. No other case in American criminal history involves the systematic serving of human remains to the general public. The efficiency and profitability of Metheny's operation allowed him to continue killing and disposing of victims for an extended period without detection. His business model had solved the traditional serial killer's problem of body disposal while actually generating income from his crimes. Chapter 5. The investigation and capture. The discovery of Joe Metheny's horrific crimes came not through traditional police investigation, but through his own boastful confessions to fellow inmates while he was in jail on unrelated charges. His need to brag about his accomplishments would ultimately lead to his downfall and expose one of the most disturbing criminal enterprises in American history. In December 1996, Metheny was arrested for the murder of two homeless men in a case unrelated to his cannibalistic activities. While in jail awaiting trial, he began telling other inmates about his previous crimes, apparently unable to resist boasting about what he considered his criminal masterpiece. Initially, other inmates and even some corrections officers dismissed Metheny's claims as the fantasies of a disturbed individual seeking attention. The idea that someone could systematically murder people and serve their flesh to unsuspecting customers seemed too outrageous to be true, even by the standards of hardened criminals. However, Metheny's stories were remarkably detailed and consistent, including specific information about locations, methods, and victims that suggested they were based on real experiences rather than fantasy. His knowledge of butchering techniques and food preparation also lent credibility to his claims. One inmate who took Metheny's confession seriously was a man facing his own serious charges who saw an opportunity to help his case by providing information to authorities. He contacted his lawyer, who in turn reached out to Baltimore police with the disturbing allegations. Detective Lieutenant William Bauer was assigned to investigate Metheny's claims. Initially skeptical, but recognizing the need to take any potential serial killing case seriously, Bauer began by interviewing Metheny directly, finding him eager to discuss his crimes in graphic detail. Metheny's confessions were chilling in their matter-of-fact tone and disturbing detail. He described his killing methods, his dismemberment techniques, and his process for preparing human flesh for consumption with the same casual attitude someone might use to discuss a hobby or business venture. The investigation team faced the unprecedented challenge of trying to verify claims about cannibalistic serial killing and the serving of human flesh to the public. There were no established protocols for this type of investigation, requiring investigators to develop new approaches and techniques. Physical evidence was limited because Metheny's method of disposal had been so thorough. By grinding and serving his victims' remains, he had essentially eliminated the traditional evidence that investigators rely on in murder cases. Bodies, crime scenes, and physical traces had all been consumed or destroyed. The search of Metheny's trailer and the area around his former food stand yielded some evidence, including tools that could have been used for dismemberment and traces of blood that suggested violent activity had occurred at these locations. However, the evidence was circumstantial and couldn't definitively prove the cannibalistic claims. Investigators began trying to identify potential victims by reviewing missing persons reports for individuals who fit Metheny's target profile: prostitutes, homeless people, and drug users who had disappeared during the time period when he claimed to be active. This process was complicated by the fact that many of these individuals' disappearances had never been reported. The investigation also involved trying to locate and interview customers who had eaten at Metheny's food stand. This process was challenging because many of the customers were transient truckers and construction workers who were difficult to track down, and because of the obvious trauma that learning the truth would cause. Medical experts were consulted to determine whether Metheny's claims about preparing and serving human flesh were technically feasible. These consultations confirmed that his described methods could indeed work and that properly prepared human meat could be disguised when mixed with conventional meat. Don't forget to like this video if you're finding this investigation as disturbing as the crimes themselves. The psychological evaluation of Metheny revealed a complex individual with multiple personality disorders. including antisocial personality disorder and possible psychopathy. However, he was found to be legally sane and fully aware of the nature and consequences of his actions. As the investigation progressed, more details emerged about the scope and duration of Metheny's crimes. While the exact number of victims could never be determined with certainty, investigators believed he had killed at least 10 people and possibly many more over a 2-year period. The case presented unique challenges for prosecutors, who had to build a case based largely on confessions and circumstantial evidence. The unprecedented nature of the crimes also raised questions about how to charge someone for serving human flesh to unknowing customers. Chapter 6. Trial, Conviction and Legacy. The trial of Joe Metheny began in 1998 and immediately became one of the most sensational criminal proceedings in Maryland history. The courtroom was packed with media representatives, legal observers, and members of the public who were both fascinated and horrified by the unprecedented nature of the charges. Prosecutor Stephen G. Bling faced the challenging task of proving crimes that were unlike anything in American legal precedent. The case involved not just multiple murders, but also the systematic serving of human flesh to unsuspecting customers, acts that challenged existing legal frameworks and required creative prosecutorial approaches. The prosecution's case relied heavily on Metheny's own confessions, which were detailed and consistent, but raised questions about their reliability, given his obvious mental health issues. Prosecutors had to convince the jury that despite his psychological problems, Metheny was telling the truth about his cannibalistic crimes. Physical evidence was limited but significant. Investigators had found tools at Metheny's trailer that were consistent with his described dismemberment methods, and blood evidence suggested that violent acts had occurred at his residence. However, the evidence was largely circumstantial and couldn't definitively prove the cannibalistic aspects of his crimes. The testimony of fellow inmates who had heard Metheny's confessions was crucial to the prosecution's case. These witnesses described in detail how Metheny had boasted about his crimes, providing information that only the actual perpetrator could have known. Their testimony helped establish the credibility of his confessions. Metheny's defense team, led by public defender Chris Floor, faced an almost impossible task given their client's detailed confessions and apparent pride in his crimes. They attempted to argue that Metheny was mentally ill and not responsible for his actions, but psychiatric evaluations showed that while he had personality disorders, he was legally sane. The defense also tried to challenge the reliability of Metheny's confessions, arguing that he was a disturbed individual who might be fabricating or exaggerating his crimes for attention. However, the consistency and detail of his accounts made this argument difficult to sustain. During the trial, Metheny showed no remorse for his crimes and seemed to enjoy the attention his case was receiving. He appeared to take pride in the shock and disgust his actions generated, viewing the trial as an opportunity to further traumatize society with the details of his crimes. The testimony of experts in forensic psychology and criminal behavior helped the jury understand how someone could commit such unprecedented crimes. These experts explained the psychological factors that could drive someone to cannibalism and the serving of human flesh to others. The impact on potential victims of Metheny's food stand was a significant concern throughout the trial. Hundreds of people had potentially consumed human flesh without knowing it, and the psychological trauma of learning this truth was considered by the court in determining appropriate sentences. On May 21, 1998, the jury returned guilty verdicts on multiple counts of murder, with the cannibalistic aspects of the crimes considered as aggravating factors. The verdicts were seen as a victory for justice and a validation of the unprecedented investigation that had brought Metheny to trial. Metheny was sentenced to death for his crimes, with the judge noting the unprecedented nature and extreme depravity of his actions. The sentence reflected both the severity of the murders and the additional trauma caused by the cannibalistic aspects of his crimes. The case had lasting impacts on law enforcement procedures and legal frameworks for dealing with unprecedented crimes. New protocols were developed for investigating cannibalistic crimes, and legal precedents were established for prosecuting cases involving the serving of human remains to unknowing victims. Make sure to share this story with others who can handle extremely mature content about criminal justice and the prosecution of unprecedented crimes. The Metheny case also influenced public health and food safety regulations, leading to increased oversight of small food vendors and better tracking of meat sources. While the specific circumstances of Metheny's crimes were unique, the case highlighted vulnerabilities in food safety systems. For the families of Metheny's victims, the trial provided some measure of closure, though many questions remained unanswered due to the complete disposal of their loved ones' remains. The case highlighted the particular challenges faced by families of victims from marginalized communities. Psychological impact on the hundreds of people who had potentially consumed human flesh at Metheny's stand was profound and lasting. Many required counseling to deal with the trauma of learning what they had unknowingly eaten, and some filed civil lawsuits seeking damages for their psychological injuries. Joe Metheny remained on death row until his death in 2017, never showing remorse for his crimes and occasionally giving interviews where he continued to boast about his cannibalistic activities. His case remains one of the most disturbing examples of serial killing in American criminal history. The legacy of the Joe Metheny case continues to influence discussions about criminal psychology, food safety, and the protection of vulnerable populations. His crimes serve as a reminder of the depths of human depravity and the importance of vigilance in protecting society's most vulnerable members. If this extremely disturbing true crime story has been as shocking as it has been educational about the darkest aspects of human behavior, subscribe to the channel to discover other real cases that have challenged our understanding of criminal psychology and the pursuit of justice.